The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good day and welcome to this session of TA Time. I am Hillary Allen and I am joined with Sarah Davey.
Good afternoon.
And today we will be talking about partial simulation and object visibility. But before we jump into that, just the very typical webinar mechanics. The important aspect of how you'll be communicating with us is please type in all of your questions in the questions box. We will see them on our end and we will answer them as they come in. Please feel free to ask questions while we go through the little presentation we have for you, or you can save them for the end. We will have time for the end as well. So we've been going through, I think this is the fourth or fifth session about building interfaces. And if you would like to build along with us, we do have the model available for download. Also, if you've missed our previous sessions, you can go to this bit.ly link and that will take you to the playlist of all of our previous sessions on how to build an interface. And just before we dive into the actual model, again, we just wanted to quickly go over some logistics of what exactly is partial simulation and object visibility. So partial simulation allows you to run the model based on what's visible within a story. It helps the user to see how the additions of variables actually changes the outcome. It's actually it's very fun, and it gets them to see some more intuitive aspects of the model as they walk through a story. And object visibility allows the author to conditionally hide objects based off from the value of a model variable. And we will show you how to do this, both of these within a story that we built last time in our session. So before we jump in, are there any questions on what we've just gone over? Or if there's something about partial simulation or object visibility you'd like to see, or make sure we would include when we go over it?
And also one other question, if I'd like to know, it'd be interesting to know how many of you that are here have ever used storytelling at all. And if you could just respond in the chat box, that would be great. If you could just answer yes or no, that would be good.
Interesting. We're getting a lot of no's. This is great. I'm glad that you've tuned in and that we will be able to sort of help you build a story to be a little bit more interesting in the models that you create. So without further ado, let's dive right into the model. So this was the story that we created last time. Oops, where'd it go?
All right. So this is the story that we created. I'll go to the model for a minute just to let you get your bearings about what we're working with. And is that it? Here we go. So this is our model all about calves turning into cows and sort of the dairy herd management model. And on the interface, we had added some graphics and some buttons for running the model and graphs for seeing output, and additional items that we can use to interact with the simulation by changing variables to see how it impacts results. And then last week, we started building a story. And we went over the basics of how to display parts of your model one bit at a time, or however much you want it at a time. And so the way that works, just quickly, a quick review, is when you are on a story page, you can tell you're in a story because the context says story. When you double click in the story, it will open up the panel on the right side, and usually this object will come up, which is a setup visibility object. And in this window, you can actually select the variables in the model that you want to have showing. So you can tell the ones we've selected by the ones that are highlighted here. So on this page, so the idea is that we gradually unfurl or expose more and more of the model as we go through the story. And as we're doing that, we probably would be adding annotations about what this conveyor of calves and gestation means and what the units are and why it's here. And likewise here, we'd explain how calves and gestation will move into the calves conveyor, et cetera, et cetera. And that all that detail about your model can be added in text boxes and annotations. But we also may want to, as a further way of explaining the model, we may also want to show the dynamics that occur with and without those variables present. So what we've done here is we've simply added a button for running the model. And we've gone over how to do that. And we've also added a graph that will include one of the variables in the model. And in this case, it's going to show us how calves and gestation change throughout the simulation. And now if I run the model, what's going to happen is the only variables that will be included in the simulation are the variables that are exposed. And in this case, it's just simply an inflow and a conveyor. And all of the other variables will be ignored. So when I run this model, I'm first, in order to run it, I'm just going to keep doing this in experiment mode since we're still working on the model as opposed to using one of the others. I find it easier to go back and forth to editing when I use experiment mode. And I run the model, and this is probably no surprise because we just have an input and a conveyor. And with when conveyors don't have outputs, it will not change at all. The value of the conveyor or stock will not change at all. So that's really not all that interesting. But if we want to then go to the next page of the story, we want to see what happens if we actually expose an outflow and as well as another conveyor and a leakage flow. So if I run the model now, we'll see that we just are getting a simple drop off of the entire population of calves. Everything is leaking out as opposed to staying in or going anywhere else. Which really, this is not probably something you would do in a real life scenario because it's not that interesting. But now, if we go to the next page, we've included the whole model. And now you'll see that when I run the model, everything will be included in the simulation. That's the general idea of how to do this. What's also interesting to note is that if you've got a converter, for instance, that's going into a flow, but the converter isn't showing, and this converter is being used in the equation of the flow, it's going to be, the value will have to be calculated somehow in that flow, and it's just going to use the initial value of this converter. So any variables that are not showing in a story, when you do a partial simulation, at least the other values will be at least their initial values will be calculated. Are there any questions about that? Okay. Okay, so at this point, I might also mention that when you build a story, you might like to have the stocks, whatever variables are showing, you might want to have them animate. So what we can do is in the settings for your story or for your interface, you can actually select show animations, you can even have it show documentation if you would like. So now when I actually run, those will animate. And if I skip down to the last page, you can see things. Oh, I have to do that here as well. show animations. So that's kind of a fun feature to add in, and even more informative, because you can actually see the behavior of that's happening in these stocks and flows and converters.
And as Sarah was showing you would have to do that on each page that you have partial simulation on. You'd have to go into settings and select whatever options you want to include. Because you can select all of them if you wanted to, but that's a pretty busy story.
Okay, so that is, unless there are questions about partial simulation in storytelling, I would also like to just point out that today we were here to mostly focus on, again, just on interface building. But I also, in case you've heard of partial simulation, not in the context of a story or the interface, I also wanted to just point out that if you're working just on a model without an interface, and you want to simulate parts of your model, that is also possible. In the model settings panel, you'll see that there is the second tab is all about partial simulation setup. This is not necessary. You don't need to do this if you're going to use this feature in a story. But if you're going to use it outside of a story, this is where you're going to set it up. In this particular model, I don't have sectors or modules. But if I had modules or sectors, those are what you can use for doing partial simulation. You can isolate a module or modules to run and let everything else be constant. And the same holds true if you're using sectors. You can do the same thing for sectors. And the reason why you might want to do that is because if you're testing, or if you're still in the process of building a model and you're doing it using modules, you might want to test individual modules one at a time before you've finished defining the rest of your model. So that's one reason. Another reason is just to simply see the impact that outputs from sectors or modules have on another module or sector. Okay. So I think at this point, do you have any questions about partial simulation? All right. So I don't see any questions coming through. So at this point, we will proceed to talk about object visibility.
So there are two different ways you can use object visibility, and the first one I will show you within storytelling. You can do this also on the basic interface page. You don't have to use it in storytelling, but so for this, let's restore all devices. So this right now, everything's sort of not running, so everything is set at 0. So what you can do is drop a text box, drop an annotation, or drop any other kind of input device you want to within the story or the interface. And we'll say, now you can see this. And you can go into this, and on the very sort of bottom of this settings panel, you'll see object visibility. And what we want to do is this object will only be visible if a particular variable is not equal to 0. So for this, we're going to say calves in gestation. So when we go into, now that it's set up, when we go into Explore mode, this text box should disappear. She doesn't. Have fun. Oh, I have to do this on page 2. Sorry, I have to do this on page 2. Let me just copy and paste all of this. And set it up so calves, not calves in gestation, but calves. So when we go here, restore all devices. There, now you see it's not visible because At this point in time, calves in gestation haven't been born, so there are no calves. So when you run it, that text box will actually appear because suddenly calves has a value greater than 0. And you can do this with really graphs, tables, input devices. You can do it on the interface. In one of our recent example models that we did on measles, this is used quite often with text boxes as they go through partial simulation, so people can see what different policies do what, and then the results will pop up in a text box.
You can also use something like this for variables that are switches. So those might be the value would be set to 1 when a certain condition is true or false.
So you may have noticed that when I went in here to set the object visibility that there's another option down here where it says or object is visible only for, and currently this says for everyone. And if I had this model set up for a multiplayer game, I can actually set up object visibility based off from role players, or if a particular player has reached a certain point and they get a little bit more information. So it can lend itself quite well to multiplayer games because you can actually give a particular player more advantage or more information than another player, and then they can play on that and based off from their results on how they've been playing the game. It's a pretty fun thing to do. So that was where you would be able to set that. So if you wanted to say this graph had multiple pages, and on one page it had information on it that you only wanted role player 1 to have, you could set that extra page to have object visibility only available to player 1. So are there any questions on object visibility and how you set it up or how you'd use it? And while we're opening the questions to that, if you've been with us in past sessions as well and you have a question about a past session on building an interface, you can ask those as well.
While you're thinking about questions, I wanted to also point out, going back to storytelling and going back to partial simulation in a story, in the example that we showed you, we actually used a run button to run the model on each step throughout the way. But you can also set the model to live mode, so that as soon as you advance the page and you show up on a new page, the model will automatically run with additional variables showing. So that's even a quicker impact versus using a run button. Okay, so are there any other questions that you'd like us to answer? It doesn't have to be about storytelling. Anything else you'd like us to demonstrate while we're here? We have allocated time to do this, and so it can be anything random. As long as it's not crazy difficult, I'm happy to take a stab at demonstrating. But if we don't get any questions in the next few minutes, we'll say goodbye, but we'll wait to see.
Also, if you go onto the isee Exchange, or if you go onto our website and look at our sample models, I think every single one of our sample models has an interface attached to it. So if you have any, if you want ideas of how finished interfaces might look, You can always peruse them and come back at us and ask us questions. How the heck did you do this? And let me just go to our webpage real fast and we can get ones up. So underneath resources, you can go to sample models, and that brings you to all of our models on the isee Exchange. And all of these will have some form of interface on them. You can tell that the more recent ones are slightly more colorful, and some of our older ones are just a little bit less colorful.
Okay, so there was a question that came through. Although I think I need a little bit more information. The question is there a way to set up multiple settings in a model so that it can be run under multiple conditions without doing it manually in a demonstration? So I'm not sure what you mean by that. Do you mean settings in the model, settings on the interface? If you can expand on the question, that would be great. Otherwise, I can email you after this session to get more detail. We'll have to get back to you. Right after the session on that one. Okay, so we do have one question. Is about showing you Causal Lens for the model. So we'll go back to the model. And I will run this. And if we are, Causal Lens is a nice tool that you can use for viewing the causes of each variable in the model. So all you need to do is select one of the variables here and pick Causal Lens from the drop-down menu. And this will show us that weaned calves is being caused by keeping heifers, selling young, and weaning calves. And so if you look at the model, you can see that's exactly what's happening. It's being caused by the inflows and outflows and the leakages. We also have an option for dynamic causes only. So you can, sometimes if it's just a constant, it's not going to show up in this list, and sometimes you won't want that. Otherwise, you can uncheck that and you'll get absolutely everything, even if it's just constant values that are going into it. You can also, the next thing you might want to do with this is to say, oh, well, I see that keeping heifers is also causing weaned calves. What is causing keeping heifers? So if you click on that, now the drop down and the variables that are causing keeping heifers will be below keeping heifers. And likewise, if I want to find out what's causing desired cow replacement, I can sort of trace back and see all of the variables that are causing each variable in the model. I can also, if I'm trying to troubleshoot because I've got some funny behavior happening around a certain time period in the model, I can also zoom in on that time, in that particular time. So maybe there's an issue. I'm not seeing anything funny in this model, but if I thought maybe around time 45, I'm having problems, I can actually really look in, get to very fine, high resolution of that time period and pick up on any oddities. We also, and just so you know, another thing you can do along those same lines is if you double click on a variable when you're in edit mode, you'll see that in the upper left-hand corner, there's a little box here called Show All Causes and Effects for this variable. If I click on that, I get another drop down of all the variables that are causing weaned calves to be the values that it is throughout the simulation, or I can find out what other variables are using it in their calculations and in their causing those variables. Okay. Okay, so we do see one other question with regard to upgrading, and we will definitely get back to you with an email with more information about that. And I think at that point, I think we're about ready to wrap up. Any other questions before we sign off? Do you want to talk about them next?
Again, these are all going to be recorded, so they are all up and available. You can work through them at your own pace. You can build your own model and use some of the tips that we've suggested for you. I believe we'll be taking a break from TA time for until about March or April, and we will come back again with another sessions of something. If you have any suggestions about what you'd like to see in the next couple of sessions, something on the model layer, or maybe something to do with some more techie stuff like sensitivity analysis. If we get too far into it, it might get into the weeds. But if you have any suggestions, feel free to email us.
And even if the suggestions are with regard to the format we're using, because we want to make good use of the time for us and for you. So we thought of this initially as sort of something similar to a TA time for students to come to their professors to ask questions. And what we're finding is that we don't get many questions. So we're trying to think of some other alternative that's still helpful for people. So do send us emails to support@iseesystems.com, or if you have one of our email addresses, you can send it directly to us as well.
All right, it looks like we're not getting any more questions. So thank you very much for listening in, and we hope you have a great holiday season.
Bye-bye.